Some members will return to their seats, please. We'll get started. This one is on 2017-107. It's basically an increase in the public safety pay adjustment to police and fire executives and to consolidate police and fire classification titles. So let's go around the table on their sides for the record. Chris, we'll start with you.
Constant. John Weddleton.
Dick Trainee.
Suzanne LaFrance.
Felix Rivera.
Pete Peterson.
Mike Abbott.
Misty Pavilla.
Dean Cates.
Okay. Mike?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The purposes of today's work session is to discuss a proposed change in the upper limit for compensation for the command executives at the police and fire department. As you remember, the Assembly last year, about this time last year, worked on similar changes for the commanders at the police and fire departments. And by commanders, I mean lieutenants and captains at APD and battalion chiefs and assistant chiefs at the fire department. So what we did was we increased those salaries, and now those folks make more than their chiefs. And now we're talking about trying to address that. So Misty's going to run through a whole bunch of numbers here. We've given them to you on paper as well, because I would not expect anyone to be able to sort of process this stuff in by watching a 15-minute PowerPoint. But these are the numbers that are driving this challenge. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, one thing, Karen Norsworthy would be here to make this presentation, but she's out of town at a Bruno Mars concert. I want to make sure that gets on the record. And despite the specific direction from her supervisor, chose to do that instead of coming here.
Is that a country and western band or what?
As far as you know, Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
That's what I thought.
He actually entertained at the Super Bowl a couple of years ago.
That's why Pete knows who it is. Exactly.
They have a wardrobe malfunction in that or what?
No, I don't believe they did.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. So these numbers right here are from APDEA and IAFF, the police and fire unions. So what we did is we took the top 15 sergeants, their factored rate of pay under the APDEA contract, and then we also took the top 6 fire captains under the IAFF contract to show you the numbers. Now, with IAFF, because they're on a 56-hour schedule, they have the 2,912 hours. So that is what makes the difference with their schedules. We've also put a note in here about the average annual overtime using 2016 numbers for a sergeant is about $15,858, and the average overtime for a senior fire captain using 2016 numbers is a $30,989.
So these are the top positions in either of the unions. So this is as much as you can, or this is the average compensation for the highest paid folks, typically the most senior, and an indication of what a typical overtime allocation or overtime earnings would be in a year. So that is the, if you will, the baseline that we have to deal with as we start trying to figure out how to pay the people that supervise these guys and how to incent people to promote from a sergeant or a senior captain into one of the command positions, the lieutenants, battalion chiefs. Okay.
So this slide right here is just representing that in 2016, you approved to create, or the Assembly approved to create, the public safety pay plan. This slide is showing the police part of the public safety pay plan. So effective on July 4th, 2016, the police lieutenants went to a 3-step tier, and the police captains went to a 2-step tier. So this slide here is showing the actual highest paid police lieutenant. We showed 6 of them based off the pay plan that we showed in the previous slide.
So it's important to note that employees that were hired before about 10 or 12 years ago were eligible for service recognition. All muni employees were eligible for service recognition. Or excuse me, all non-reps were eligible for service recognition, which was an incentive program that added to people's wages based on years of service. And there were 3 steps at like 10, 15, and 20 years, I think, right? And the top step was 10%?
10.5.
10.5%. So what you saw on the previous slide was the base rate for lieutenants and captains at APD. This is the real rate for lieutenants and captains at APD, if you take into account their service recognition on top of their base rate. So now we have about 12, 13 lieutenants at APD, and you can see what the top 6 of them, so roughly the top half of them make. And you can sort of compare that back to what they would have made as sergeants if they had stayed as sergeants. So there's really not much of a pay raise between going from sergeant to lieutenant. There's a little bit, but not a ton. This also doesn't recognize, because I forgot to ask for it to be recognized, is lieutenants are eligible for overtime. So, and they do earn it, not like sergeants do in the police department, but there would be a little bit of overtime that would be added to here as well. So, anyway, sorry to keep jumping in here, but these are complicated topics, and I think they need a little flavor. Thanks, Misty.
Okay. So, and then there's the top 3 police captains and their rates in this. So the next slide then shows the fire assistant chiefs and the fire battalion chiefs had different effective dates when they came into the public safety pay plan based off the previous ordinance change May of 2016. So that put the assistant chiefs in a 2-step plan pay, and the battalion chiefs went into a 3-step. So the next slide shows the actual top battalion chiefs and what their annual salary would be based off their factored rated pay, and they also are including with the service recognition. And then there are 3 assistant chiefs, and this is the 3 assistant chiefs and what their annual salaries are with the service recognition. Then we move to the actual language that is currently under code, which provides for the police and the fire chief at a grade 24 having a maximum allowable salary of $137,625 annually, but they actually are making $137,009 annually. So the deputy chiefs, even though there aren't any under the police, they are vacant, and the police ones have been, at least one has been vacant for a year. Shows that the maximum salary for deputy chiefs are the $121,521 per the code, but the fire deputy chief is actually making $121,451.
So the way the executive salaries work here at the Muni is that there are upper limits first, executives are compensated as determined by the mayor. The mayor sets their salaries.
Those that work for the executive branch. We
That's
set the
correct.
executives who work for the
That's
assembly.
true. Sorry about that, Mr. Chairman.
Sorry, there is a difference.
So almost every executive salary is set by the mayor. But there are upper limits in all of that, and they're what we call bands. There's about 5 different bands for execs. There's a 25, that only has 1 position in it. And then there's about 10 positions that are listed that are in the 24 grade. And the upper limit for the 24s is $137,000. The police and fire chiefs are both in that band. They're one of those 10 or 12 positions that's in that band. But they are maxed out at 137, and earlier this year, the mayor pushed both of the 2 chiefs up to $137,000, just short of what their maximum is. And then you can see the deputy chief, the upper limit on that. The 23s have a lot more jobs that fall into that. A lot of department managers, frankly, are capped at that 121 level. And then a few non-department managers are in that band, including the police and fire deputy chiefs. So right now, only the deputy fire chief is the only filled deputy position that we have right now, and it's compensated just under the legal maximum at 121.4. APD currently has 2 acting deputy chiefs. They are both captains, Captain McCoy and Captain Case. You saw them earlier on the captain's page, and functionally, for them to take permanent appointments as deputy chiefs under the current situation, they would take $30,000 pay raises. And, or pay cuts, sorry, that just undercut my argument right there. Yeah, they would take $30,000 pay cuts, roughly 20%. So numbers that we should not expect folks that are supporting families, that are working towards pensions, to accept. They're great people, but they're not that great, and we don't want them, frankly, to have to take that sort of hit to do a harder job. So, keep going.
So this actually is the comparison that Mike was just talking about the highest paid positions in each rank. And this will show that the deputy chiefs and the police chiefs make less than the top paid union represented employees.
And don't forget on the union reps, you need to add $15,000 of overtime in police and $30,000 in fire. Average. Those are the averages.
So this also shows that, through last year's ordinance, we were able to help and fix the inequities of the middle management. It still left the inequities in the top management. So then with if the public safety pay adjustments, with the proposed language, this is showing what the maximum allowable example would be. So we use the 5% on here. If this was passed and if the mayor chose to use it for critical and difficult to fill positions, it would show that there would be 5% over the police captains to create the deputy public safety chief, and then it would be 5% over that to create the public safety chief's position. And then it would be similar for the fire assistant chief, that we would take 5% at the max to create the deputy public safety chief, and then 5% of that would be the chief's.
That is the core of our proposal right there. And then we're also taking the opportunity here to do a little bit of monkeying around with the classification language for a variety of technical reasons, which we're more than happy to talk about if you really can't sleep one night. We would like to consolidate the deputy chief classification between the 2 departments and consolidate the chief positions between the 2 departments, so that there is a single classification for either fire or police chief and a single classification for deputy chiefs as well. So that has no impact on current staffing, doesn't create positions, doesn't eliminate positions, doesn't change anything except in our classification universe. In a weird way, it means a lot to PERS, probably not to anybody else.
Okay. We have some assembly questions, if you don't mind.
I was expecting that.
Okay, what's the average pay increase going to be for the deputies? Do we know?
Bring back the slide you just had up there. There you go. So right now, the police captains are at least the obvious place from where we would draw candidates for deputy chief. That's not a guarantee to that, but that's a good working assumption. So right now, we have police captains that make in the high 150s or as much as 162. So if they were promoted, if they accepted an executive position, the mayor could go up to 169.8 with their salaries. So they could get functional raises of $7,000 or $8,000. If again, I would stipulate, if it was a police captain that was promoted into a police deputy chief position. And that's certainly the scenario we plan for, although that's not required.
Chris?
Yeah, so just on your slide of your proposed public safety pay adjustment, you have the classes you're talking about coming up with a single class, which is the chiefs and the deputy chiefs. What's the difference in pay there? There's a pretty substantial difference, about $5,000 between a deputy fire chief and a deputy police chief.
Because they're based on a 5% increase over the next lower position. And the next lower position makes has different compensation between police and fire. So assistant chiefs make a different wage than police captains, although they're comparable in their command structures.
Right.
They aren't paid the same. So they're similar, but not exactly the same. And so when you multiply each of them by 5%,
Right.
you get slightly different numbers.
So then the question comes to mind, if functionally speaking, you're moving towards a shared classification, wouldn't we want to consider working towards a parallel pay structure?
That hadn't been a priority. The classification, consolidating the classification does not mean that we have to pay everybody inside the classification the same.
Right.
So there's no necessary reason to do that. We set it up this way because if for some reason police captains and fire assistant chiefs got further out of whack for whatever reason, we wouldn't need to pay. If 5% was really what it thought to incent somebody to promote, we wouldn't need to pay somebody 5% more than a police captain. If they're an assistant chief and they're paid less than a police captain, then their 5% only needed to be less. So we were trying to be sensitive to that and not create a system where somebody could get a big raise for an incremental promotion. That was the justification. It's not a core challenge for us if the assembly thought an alternative was made more sense.
And it just seems, even with what I heard you say, that their functional position and the hierarchies are the same, and really they're working all the time because their positions are pretty on the job, their duties.
Oh yeah, these are salaried positions.
Yeah.
They're not eligible for overtime, and these are not 40-hour jobs.
Right.
I mean, and they don't have to be, and so the expectations are significantly beyond 40 hours. As are the captains
Anything else,
and
Chris?
assistant chiefs as well.
Suzanne, ma'am?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That
Good to you,
partially answers
John.
my question. So when we're talking about executives, to be absolutely clear, we're talking about the deputy chiefs and the chief?
Correct.
And these are management positions, not represented,
These are executive positions, so they serve at the pleasure of the mayor.
and they're not represented?
That is correct.
And no overtime? Okay, and I assume too, last year's 2016 increases were to bring those salaries in line with lower 48 salaries, or?
They certainly remain at or below lower 48 averages,
Okay.
but our primary purpose was in being able to incent police sergeants and senior captains in the fire department to apply for either police lieutenant or fire battalion chief positions, because up until then, they just weren't doing it. We had, it was particularly acute in the police department. They would post for lieutenants and nobody would list
Okay.
because they'd be taking a horrendous pay cut to do so, and give up a lot of other. When you're a senior sergeant in the police department, you get to bid your shifts. So if you prefer day shift, you get that. You prefer swings or mids, you get that. Different detective or other assignments. So when you promote, if you go from there to a lieutenant, which is in the non-rep class, you don't have any more control over your assignments. The chief and the chain of command at the department assigns lieutenants to different commands, different units, at their sole discretion. So certainly lieutenants can make requests and all the rest of it, but if the chief decides you're gonna, be on the mid shift, better figure out where you like to get your coffee at 3 a.m. because that's how you're going to be spending,
3 donuts.
somewhere between a few months and a few years. So it is a real challenge, and the same thing's true at fire. Not so much promoting to battalion chiefs. Battalion chiefs remain on a Kelly shift schedule. They work the 56-hour week, the kind of weird 24 on, 24 off type schedule. That's a huge, by the time you've been a fire employee long enough to be considered to be a battalion chief, that's a pretty big part of your life and your family and, whatever your spouse is doing, et cetera. So to get people to convert to alternative schedules is a big deal. And then at the same time, to ask them to give up 20-25% of their pay, we were just, we would get, to their credit, the sergeants and senior captains, they did not laugh out loud, but they politely thanked us and probably giggled behind their breath as to why we would even think they would consider such a position. So, that's the rationale. But we do have good comparable data from other areas, and nothing in these, our police chief, even if was paid at the maximum described here, would still be paid below average for departments of our size.
And so sergeants, forgive me, just the sergeants, lieutenants, captains, those are not represented. Those are management as well.
Sergeants are represented. That is the highest you can go in the
Okay.
union. Same thing with the senior captain,
Okay.
senior fire captain.
Got it.
On the fire department list.
Okay.
The next two levels are what we call non-reps. There are sort of supervisory class, not formally represented, but supported by personnel rules that occasionally look a lot like a bargaining agreement. And then the last two positions on these charts are the two exec positions. So you're seeing three different classes or classifications of employees among those 5 positions that are here.
Thank you.
Mr. Busk, anything, ma'am? I hear you're online.
Yeah, I'm on the line. No, not right now.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson, sir.
Got a couple. One is in the C. It says $49,000. Is that just for the next 4 months, or what period of time?
I believe so.
That was, I think that was done by our internal auditor. Mike?
Right. If the mayor took advantage of this, and that assumes that we fill the deputy police chiefs as well, I believe. So that may or may not happen. They're vacant now. We would not be asking for additional budgeted funds in the current year to cover this. The departments would absorb that if the mayor changed anybody's salary. And that is not a foregone conclusion.
Okay, and
Mr. Wilson?
can I just have?
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Why didn't we do this when we did the mid-range people last year in 16?
2 reasons. It would have taken a separate ordinance anyway.
Oh.
We could have run them at the same time, but we chose not to. We, essentially, frankly, weren't sure how we were going to handle the execs at that time. But there's certainly no reason why we couldn't have functionally, to be honest, and I think it was mostly me, I recommended that we not do it then because I hadn't yet made a recommendation to the mayor on what to do about the execs, and I wasn't ready. And frankly, we could not wait, in my judgment, on the lieutenants and the mid-range commander slots because of critical staffing problems.
Okay, and if a sergeant is an acting lieutenant, they get a 5% raise over their base raise now.
There is something in the contract, I don't remember the exact number, but there is acting pay if they act as a lieutenant.
So if they're acting now and they move into this new pay rate, someone else will take their position.
We will backfill, likely, we will backfill for a sergeant behind them. And so somebody will be promoted from officer to sergeant. And that's a union-driven process. There's a very specific, lengthy section of the contract that deals with promotion from officer to sergeant.
Okay, I'd like to see the comps with other cities. If you could
Okay.
email that around.
Yeah, my data's a year or so old, but I can perfect that, I think, in short order.
That, or just give us a
Optimistic.
general idea would be nice
Okay.
to have. Thanks.
Yes, Chris?
So is the implication then that these unfilled positions are in part due to this factor of inability to pay them, an increase, they would actually take a cut? Is that the broader implication in simple terms?
I am confident that I could not convince police captains to promote to. There's 3 of them, or 4 of them, excuse me, right now.
Vacancies.
To take permanent positions as deputy chief. Now, we're not required to hire police captains for those jobs, and there may well be other qualified applicants. I can't speak to that, but yes, I'm confident that that's true, and I'm similarly confident that were the deputy fire chief position vacant, the same thing would be true of the current assistant chiefs at AFD.
Other questions from members? Yes, Suzanne?
So I support the logic of this, the idea that especially if we're looking at supervisory management levels, you wouldn't have a lower level supervisor making more than a higher supervisor. And I think that many people recognize that represented individuals will often have spikes in pay due to overtime.
Mm-hmm.
The reality I'm struggling with is, given budget pressures, this is hard to, it's a little bit hard to explain to people. When people see wow, you just increased all these salaries and you're telling everybody, get ready for a 5 to 10% cut, possibly. What can you tell us that would make
Sure.
that case or make
Well,
it easier?
the argument I made to the mayor and others, and believe me, everybody has the same level of sensitivity. Nobody likes bringing forward pay raise recommendations. We didn't like it a year ago, last summer, when we did it for the mid-level police and fire commanders, and we don't like it for the execs today. But if there were 2 departments that you want to make sure that you have the best possible leadership in your departments, I would suggest it is the police and fire department. And you don't want the only candidates that are interested to be the ones that either, for whatever reason, aren't interested in money, and to not have available to you candidates that are making very reasonable personal finance and career decisions, not to even apply for these important positions. So it comes down to that, basically. If we want to sort of limit the candidate pool for these kind of positions, this is what, then the status quo is fine. And I'm not saying that we'll never fill another chief or DC position. That would be disingenuous. But we will not be able to draw from the pool of candidates that any mayor would want to choose from. And it's Mayor Berkowitz who's willing to bite the bullet and, take the hit for being the one to introduce this. But I guarantee you, every mayor that served for the last 5 generations of mayors and the next 5 will be grateful to have a salary schedule. They don't have to pay people this much money. And if mayors can find people that are the folks that they want, that will accept a lesser salary, more power to them. But this will allow a mayor to consider both, and now you're even including out-of-state or non-local candidates. if we posted a chief's position for Anchorage, 300,000 people, 400 plus sworn officers, another 120, 140 non-sworn officers. If we posted that nationally, we would not get anybody with the sort of experience in our type of department, not leading our type of department. You look at, you know, and I think these are the numbers I'll be able to bring you: Portland, Spokane, Stockton, West Coast, non-giant cities. I'm not going to suggest that you need to pay what the chief of LAPD makes or something like that. But I think you're going to see the majority of those that are over $200,000, and in places with lower cost of living than Anchorage.
Mike, what's the executive pay increase this year? Because you guys are programming the
The
budget.
generic increase that we gave for almost all execs in 2017 was 1.5%. And we haven't yet written, obviously, the 2018 budget, but I presume it'll be something similar.
Okay. Other questions, Mr. members? Yes, Pete?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, thinking about next year's budget, if we pass these increases and we're putting next year's budget together, how much would the increase be for the police department and the fire department?
Well, it depends if the mayor changes anybody's salary as a result of this. And I'm not trying to be coy. I would expect that, at least for planning purposes, that salaries will go up beyond what they are today. We're not doing this as an academic exercise. I think they're necessary, and I expect some growth over the 121 for deputy chiefs, and perhaps even over the 137 for the two chiefs. I don't think they'll necessarily move in tandem. There's no necessary reason why they would need to, and they may not move on the same timeline either. But I do, so I would expect them to go up. I would not expect that to have a measurable impact on their budgets.
The problem, Pete, is there's no income stream increasing.
Right.
So what we're going to have to do is you're going to have to be taking from one area to put another area, whether it's their department or ours. We have some hard times coming from this town. So, any other questions on this? Yes, John.
So, again, we're dealing with this for police and fire, but every department must face the same kind of issue, doesn't it?
Certainly not to this extent. I would say that there's the only department that has something somewhat similar is ML&P. Their IBEW employees make a lot, especially when it comes to overtime and acting pay. And so in that department, there are situations where it is very difficult to recruit non-reps or execs from out of the union positions. We're not bringing forward that recommendation today. And I'm not saying it would never come, but I think in that example, and one of the other things, and Misty can go to the slide where we have the endorsements from the Human Resources Advisory Board. So you can see by code, a proposal like the one we're making is required to be approved or reviewed by the HRAB. And this is in your packet, we won't read it to you, but they endorsed this recommendation. But what they said was before they see other before they endorse other recommendations for executive salary changes, they want to see a so-called compensation survey. And that's a relatively broad-based deal where you look at comparables in Alaska, outside Alaska, private sector, public sector, et cetera, for similar or like positions. And then you compare those to the muni, and then you potentially build new salary structures around that. That has not taken place, and it is nothing like that is currently planned. Although, speaking for as the city manager, I would heartily endorse it. One of the things you should think about, though, is if we do it, it's going to show that muni officials are underpaid relative to their peers in the public and private sector. But that's not the topic of conversation today. But so that gets at your point, Mr. Chairman, that there are other underpaid deals. And John's point about ML&P, we would not likely bring forward further recommendations, whether it's at ML&P or other places, without going through the sort of rigor that the HRAB recommended. We felt the police and fire positions were so obvious and so glaring, given the huge disparities between the compensation systems for the different ranks, that that sort of survey was not required.
So
Yes,
you
Chris.
said heartily, not hardly, right?
Correct.
Okay.
Any other questions, from Assembly members? We'll be doing this on Tuesday. Thank you.